Alright class, now that we have knit this chunk of fabric where we're practicing the knit and the purl stitch row by row, now we're going to get ready to transition in between the knit and the purl stitch on the same row as we knit along. And this is the portion where we're going to do the ribbed stitch, which again is that elastic kind of stitch that we see on the hem of hats, the end of sleeves, or the hem of a sweater. It has kind of a bouncy elasticity to it. So when I bring in our sample scarf here, we can look at these rib stitches and see that they come in sets. So this is a 1 by 1 ribbed stitch, which means when I look at the V's here, I only see one row of V's, and then we've got the U, which we recognize now as our knit stitch and our purl stitch. And then if we move up to the next row, this is a 2 by 2 ribbed stitch. So I see 2 rows of V's, 2 rows of U's, and if we flip it over to the other side, we see exactly the same thing. So remember how I said that a knit stitch is the reverse of a purl stitch and vice versa? So if I look at my first row here, this is clearly a knit stitch, but if I flip it over on the other side, it's a purl stitch. So this row would go 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit. On the front side, it's 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl. So let's go ahead and show you how this stitch works. Alright, so we're going to start with a 1 by 1 ribbed stitch, which means that every other row or every other stitch is going to be knit and every other stitch is going to be purl. So get ready, hold our yarn just like we have been, and we're going to go ahead and knit the first stitch, and we're going to get ready to purl this second stitch. Now the important thing in this technique is passing the yarn back and front. So let me undo it. I just knit that first stitch with my yarn in the back, the normal position for knitting a stitch, and now I need to transition my yarn to the front to purl. So the way I remember this is oftentimes in knitting our needles are crossed, but whenever we're transitioning from a knit to a purl stitch, I think about drawing up a drawbridge. So I need to open up that cross in order for my yarn to pass through. So let me show you again. My needles are often crossed, but I need to open up that drawbridge in order to pass my yarn through. So knit position in the back, purl position in the front, and you have to have an opening for that yarn to pass in between the two. So I'm going to go ahead and purl the next stitch, pull it through, and we're going to knit the next stitch. Open up the drawbridge, pass it through, purl, open up the drawbridge, pass it through, knit. So this is where our stitch markers are going to become a little bit more important, because when we are passing between the knit and the purl stitch, when we're crossing that yarn back and forth, it becomes a little bit easier to accidentally add a stitch to your work. So let me show you how that might happen. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to purl this stitch, and let's say I forget to pass my yarn back through. So I just purled, my yarn is in the forward facing position, and I'm about to knit my next stitch. If I were to forget to pass it through and I went ahead and knit my next stitch, can you see how we just crossed that yarn over our needle, and we actually created another loop over the top of our needle? Now once we come back around, if we don't notice that this is an extra loop here, if we aren't counting our stitches and realizing that something is amiss, that shouldn't belong there, we might accidentally knit that or purl it. We might accidentally stitch that as an additional stitch. So now I have 6 stitches in between these 2 spacers, or 2 counters. So let me back that up and just release that. So, so we purled this stitch. I need to pass it through, knit the next stitch, and let me show you how this happens from a knit to a purl. So let's say I have my yarn in the back, I forget to pass it through, or I just kind of loop it over the top of my needle, and I think, okay, I'm ready to purl my next stitch. I enter from the back, I wrap the yarn around, pull it through. So I just purled that stitch, but I accidentally added another loop there on my work. So you can see it becomes a little bit easier to accidentally add an additional stitch if you're not paying attention to your work as we are transitioning between the knit and the purl stitch. So remember to raise your drawbridge, open that up as you're passing your yarn back and forth. As we knit with our yarn in the back, open the drawbridge, bring the yarn forward, purl with the yarn in the front. So I want you guys to go ahead and do a couple rows here, practice with a 1 by 1 rib stitch, which means that every other row is knit and purl. And I'm going to get to the end of this row and I'm going to show you what happens when we flip the work here. Purl, knit, and purl. There we go. Now I flip my work and I can see that my yarn is in the backward facing position, and also this appears to be a V. So if we look at this stitch on the end here, so I know that on the other side I just purled that stitch there. Once I flip it, that becomes a knit stitch. So the back side is always the opposite. So this is a purl stitch on this front side and a knit stitch on this back side with my yarn in the back. So this row is going to start with a knit and continue with our every other row of knit and purl. So knit, purl, knit, purl. All right. Now one other skill or thing I want to show you guys and watch out for as you're knitting and purling, and we're starting to get down these techniques. One other way that you could potentially accidentally add a stitch or kind of mess up your stitch count a little bit is if our yarn splits. So I'm gonna kind of pull this apart a little bit. This happens with multi-ply yarns. So this is a 4-ply yarn, and sometimes if the yarn just is a little bit frayed in one spot or the tension is a little bit off, you can get a spacing in the ply of the yarn, the twist of those strings together. And sometimes we accidentally puncture the yarn with our needle rather than scooping the whole yarn. See how when we get the whole yarn and all the plies are together, there's no splitting. Occasionally it will happen where you accidentally split the yarn, and sometimes you accidentally kind of split that yarn and knit a portion of the yarn, and then you still have one of those plies hanging out on your needle. So just kind of watch your work as you knit and just kind of try to keep a visual. Anytime you see like a particularly like frayed or part of your yarn that has a bit of tension that's off, just go ahead and make sure you get all of that ply onto the needle in one go. You don't want to be splitting your yarn as you knit. And we just want to continue to use our stitch markers, get a nice easy visual count as we go to make sure that we have the correct number of stitches in between each marker. All right, I'm going to go ahead now and give us our knit and purl ribbed stitch. So go ahead and give yourself about 2.5 inches of 1x1 ribbed stitch, and then we will reconvene and we will cover the 2x2 ribbed stitch. Alright guys, so we have finished our 1x1 rib stitch here, and as you can see, got this nice stretchy 1x1 rib stitch. And now I'm going to show you guys how to do the 2x2 ribbed stitch. Now, when it comes to question of functionality and which ones should you use with which project, that is really a matter of personal preference and visual preference and kind of thinking about the design element that you might want to incorporate. Some people like the chunkier 2x2 rib, and that creates more of a chunkier visual, a little more blocky. And then some people prefer the visual of the 1x1 ribbed stitch, which is a little bit more muddled in texture. So this I would say is a bit chunky, and this is more of a sort of softer, more muddled ribbed stitch. So I'm trying to get you guys in the mindset of thinking about sort of the design elements, these stitches as different methods of design. Alright, so for our 2x2 rib stitch, very similar, you might have already assumed that, but we are going to knit 2 stitches and then purl 2 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2, and then open up the drawbridge, pull your yarn around, purl 1, purl 2, open up the drawbridge, bring your yarn to the back, knit 1, move our slider, knit 2, open up the drawbridge, pull the yarn around. So we're just going to continue that pattern of knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. And you can do a 3x3 rib stitch, you can do a 2x2 rib stitch. It's really a matter of preference here. Typically you won't see more than a 3x3 rib stitch in any given pattern. That's usually kind of where they max out. Not to say it's impossible, you might see it, but usually a 3x3 is where they max out. Alright, so flip our work. We ended on a purl stitch with our yarn in the front. We're going to flip our work over. That means we're starting on a knit stitch. And hopefully you guys are really getting adjusted to seeing the V and the U. So I know that this smooth V shape here, that's a knit. And when I see these little bumpies, when I see the lumps, I know that's a purl stitch. So we're going to knit 2, open the gate, purl 2, open the gate, pass it through, knit 2, open the gate, pass it through, purl 2, open the gate, knit 2, open the gate, purl 2. Alright, want you guys to go ahead and practice this 2x2 rib stitch for a little bit. Create a lead of fabric for yourself and get adjusted to creating this spacing of the 2x2 ribbed stitch. And we'll meet back when we are ready to move on to our next stitch. You can see here, let me focus in a little bit. So we've got bump, bump, V, V, bump, bump, V, V. So we can see the visual of purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit. And hopefully you guys are starting to identify the difference visually between these two stitches. We have just finished our 2x2 rib stitch, which as you can see how wide it is down here, and then we get this springy effect that happens on the rib stitching. So the next stitch that we're going to learn today is the seed stitch. And I really enjoy the seed stitch. I think it is a really versatile and lovely stitch. It adds a lot of texture and depth to your work and incorporates just these two simple knit and purl stitches, and I think it creates a really kind of complex looking fabric, and it does a great job showing off beautiful yarns. Alright, so similar to how we were transitioning in our 1x1 rib stitch between a knit and a purl stitch, we are going to start by doing every other stitch knit and purl. So knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. And you're going to continue that all the way down. So knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. Remembering to open the drawbridge gates every time you pass your yarn through. And again, I'm moving quickly because I know you guys already know how to do this stitch. I'm just going to get to the end of the row so that I can flip the work and show you what happens next. If you do need a refresher on the knit or the purl stitch, you can always go back to prior video footage and revisit the 1x1 rib stitch, or even earlier where we talk about knit and purl. Okay, so we just finished knitting and purling every other row. Now we're going to flip the work. Now, as you can see, my first stitch here appears to be a knit stitch. We have the V there on the edge, and my yarn is in the back, so it would appear that I would knit this first stitch. But to create the seed stitch, we're actually going to purl all of our knit stitches and knit all of our purl stitches. So we're just doing the opposite on every stitch of what we just did. So I see the V here, and the yarn is facing towards the back. That means I just knit that stitch. So now we are going to bring our yarn to the front. We're going to enter from the back, cross over, and we're going to purl that knit stitch. And then we're going to switch to the opposite, bring our yarn to the back, and see the little bump here. That would indicate that this is a purl stitch right there. So I just transitioned my yarn to the back, and I'm going to knit the purl stitch. So we're purling the knit stitch, knitting the purl stitch. So we're simply switching every other row, and we're just transitioning back and forth between our knit and our purl stitches. And I will provide a chart on this to give you guys a visual chart on how to follow along with this. Alright, so we're going to continue this stitch, continue switching back and forth until you have a length of fabric and you've gotten used to flipping back and forth with the knit and purl stitches. And once you have a bit of fabric knit out there, we're going to go ahead and reconvene. Alright, so I want you guys to work on the seed stitch and the rib stitch for this week's homework. If you do struggle with any of these things, don't worry, we're going to chat in our Zoom call. But go ahead and give this a try. And the good news is once you get these two techniques down, we really open a lot of doors here for design and for techniques, and we can start to add in a little bit of creativity and experimentation. So go ahead and practice those. I have one more skill that I want to cover in today's class. There will be an additional video to this, which is going to be swatching our work, which is how we figure out how much yarn we need to cast on for a particular size project. So that's how we gauge size when we're working. So this is our knitting assignment, and we're going to cover one more skill in today's class. But I hope this goes well for you guys, and I look forward to seeing you in our next class and in our Zoom call.